Section B, Edexcel 2019. Let's get right on with it and started with this question. So it looks like it's on the energy market sector. But yeah, 6A, 5-mark question. With reference to extract A, explain question, the difference between a positive and a normative statement. So this looks like quite an easy 5-mark question, but let's have a look at section A. So what I'm looking for in section A is just some positive and some normative statements, since of course there will be a few application marks here, and then it should be a very simple question where you just explain the differences between positive and normative, give a few examples, and that should be fine. So first things first, we have an example of a positive statement. So it says the new legislation will the energy bills of 11 million households will be capped for as long as 5 years. Of course, that is a stat, that is a figure, that's something you can test. So of course that would be a positive statement. Claim it could save households hundreds of pounds a year. And remember, what is the difference between positive and normative statement? Positive statement, remember, the main thing is it does not have to be correct. The main thing is backed up by evidence. It can just be tested, and if it can be tested, like I said, it does not necessarily have to be correct. So even if this cap doesn't save households hundreds, it can be tested, therefore it's a positive statement, whilst of course normative statements are more opinion based. Here, so when it's said also in the title, but the market is broken, the Prime Minister says. So the Prime Minister repeated their claims that she had to act the market is broken. That is a very subjective statement where some people may think the market is functioning perfectly, or the market is partially broken. So therefore that is of course an opinion, and when it's an opinion, we of course would call it a normative statement. Then if we keep going, our broken energy market has to change. It has to offer fairer prices, and of course fair is a massive opinion. What one person deems fair is another person might deem it unfair. That, like I said, it's another example of a normative statement. And again, if we keep going, a price cap will not be good for customers will not be good. It could be good for some customers, it might not be good for others. So again, that's an opinion that cannot necessarily be tested. How do we know it's not good for every single customer? But yeah, we've got enough there, and like I said, this 5-mark question is fairly simple. So I'm just going to quote about 1 or 2 of the bits of the extract, and that should be very easy 5 marks here. Okay, so that is what I'd write to get 5 marks there. So very simply, positive statement can be tested via stats/evidence. It does not have to be correct. Energy bills for 11 million households will be capped for 5 years. Then normative statements are opinion based. They cannot be tested and usually include a value judgment. E.g., fairer prices for customers who are paying. So of course fairer. This is a subjective statement. It stems from the individual's opinions. That's basically what value judgment is. Therefore, cannot be tested, and therefore is a normative statement. So it's very simple 5-mark question to make sure you get the application in to pick up those marks. And let's keep going and move on to the 8-mark question. So with reference to extract B, examine the likely benefits to consumers of the integration between BT and EE. So before we even actually look at extract B, what is going to be the benefits to consumers? A very simple question of the integration of basically 2 big mobile networks. First thing that comes to my mind is you will get almost like better mobile service, like you'll get service in better areas. And what would we call that in economics? Of course, it would just be better quality product. And then now let's think about it. So quality is also increasing. Let's think about price. If 2 of the biggest mobile networks are joining, you can almost say that the economies of scale will now join. And if they have larger economies of scale, they can exploit those economies of scale more. They can run down longer average costs further, therefore meaning that they can therefore have lower costs and charge consumers lower prices. And yeah, those are the main 2 benefits that come to my mind straight away. But let's have a read of this extract B and let's see what it's saying. So the first thing is that BT's profit rises, and let's see why this is happening. And the integration results in BT controlling 35% of the mobile consumer market. Of course, you could label it now as a legal monopoly. And its profit in the second quarter 2017. Good stats here, because of course for your 8-mark question, there will be marks for application. So yeah, this ties into what we were saying about better service, where they're able to choose between BT, EE, or PlusNet. So whatever suits them best, so essentially meaning that they get a choice of 3 rather than just having 1. And then this acquisition enables us to create value bundles, so like that could link into the cheaper prices. So let's get started, and for the first paragraph I'm just going to talk about, since I think this is going to be the slightly chunkier paragraph, is going to be talking about the lower prices. And the application I'm going to use here is this. They're able to offer great value bundles, and that's going to tie into my price thing. Essentially, my main chain of analysis is going to be based on, like I said, economies of scale. So I'm going to say with these firms like BT, EE merging, it's going to lead to now they're going to have larger joint economies of scale, therefore can further exploit these economies of scale. Then, of course, like I always say, I'm just going to give an example of one of the economies of scale, either being technical, purchasing. Purchasing probably works quite well here, since they can use that bulk buying power to run down the longer average costs. Lower costs, therefore, could mean it could be translated for consumers into lower prices. Okay, so that's how I'd word that paragraph. So consumers will benefit from lower prices, e.g. able to offer great value bundles. That is a bit of application from the extract. With BT and EE merging means that joint larger economies of scale, e.g. purchasing economy of scale, buying in larger volumes, it increases the bargaining power, thus able to negotiate lower costs, so run down the LRAC. And lower costs can be translated, passed on to consumers via lower prices, thus increasing the consumer surplus, which is very easy, very standard paragraph here. And now let's move on to the evaluation. Of course, there's only 2 evaluation marks here, but let's try and pick them up. And of course, I think a really good one here is just with regards to, it talks about the market shares. The market share, BT and EE will now be classed as a legal monopoly. Therefore, of course, this means have monopoly power, and of course we're talking about the benefits to consumers. You could mention, however, in evaluation, this depends on BT and EE's monopoly power, as they now, with over 25% market share, as of 35%, they're classed as the legal monopoly, therefore could exploit consumers with higher prices, and there's like a slight lack of choices as they have that monopoly power. And of course, an even more specific one would be just talking about economies of scale, as in reality, joining these economies of scale will be quite difficult, and when the mergers do happen like this, it can lead to diseconomies of scale, and it's quite hard for example, the new teams to work together. It takes a bit of time for these to gel, and that would lead to initially diseconomies of scale. So that is how I write my second and my 2 evaluation points. Of course, kept them quite brief, didn't really. And that is just the 2 points. I haven't added any detail into the writing. But yeah, now let's move on to the second point, which is of course improvements in quality. So for this second paragraph, the way I'm going to develop the chain of analysis is essentially that the improvements in quality will be due to, as they merge, they have more monopoly power, they'll make larger supernova profits, they're going to invest these large supernova profits into R&D, and therefore, in the long run, it's going to lead to better quality products for the consumers. So they're going to use that supernova profit to invest into R&D, become innovative, and make these innovative products, meaning in the long run, better quality products. And of course, simplest evaluation is, however, in evaluation, this depends on the time frame. Why? As although they will be providing these better quality products in the long run, in the short run, they're going to use this monopoly power, they're going to exploit these consumers in the short run with higher prices, thus you can evaluate the long run benefits versus the short run costs. So essentially just dynamic efficiency. But yeah, a fairly simple and a fairly straightforward 8-mark question there. Quite a nice one, I would say. And yeah, moving on to this 10-mark question. With reference to extract C, assess possible reasons why many landline-only customers do not switch to a cheaper telephone provider. First thing that should pop into your mind, very small part of your spec, is to do with more behavioural economics. We call it consumer inertia. What is consumer inertia? Essentially, it's the concept where consumers do not switch to cheaper providers. Essentially, they're quite comfortable with the current provider, they can't really be bothered to switch, and they overestimate the cost of switching or how hard it is to switch. And this probably relates to you a lot, for example, with mobile providers. For example, no one really switches unless you're out of contract because it's just easier to remain. But what does this therefore mean? Consumer inertia, in the end of the day, this is a behavioural economics link, but what does it in the end lead to? It leads to a slight degree of inelastic demand. Why is that? So even if consumers aren't getting the best deal they could be, due to consumer inertia, it therefore will mean that these consumers will have a degree of inelastic demand. As like I said, they're paying higher prices than they should be paying. And then let's have a look at extract C for some other reasons. And even before looking at the extract, you can probably just think of some reasons. So why some people might not switch to a cheaper telephone provider. Talking about the demographics of population, like a lot of these questions, you can probably even deduce them without the extract. So let's have a look at this extract C. Okay, so this talks about the telephone only contract. It is falling about £7 a month. After regulator attacked existing deals as poor value for money. This will save million landline customers £84 a year. And now this is a very interesting bit, because the bills for landline-only customers, nearly 2/3 of whom are over 65. Now, why is that interesting? Why is this demographic of this population interesting? As, of course, old people are not as teched up as young people. Therefore, how is that going to affect the ability to switch? Very simply, they don't have the information. It is definitely imperfect information, an information gap, asymmetric information. This is definitely an example of an information gap, as these elderly individuals do not have the correct information, don't know how to do it. Therefore, it means that they will end up overpaying. Thus, of course, that is a misallocation of resources. And then, of course, towards the bottom of this paragraph as well, so Ofcom focused on BT because they counted 2/3 of the 1.5 million landline-only customers, and then it talks about the dominant position of BT. So essentially, this is what is this talking about? It's essentially talking about monopoly power they have. And then essentially just talks about how BT is in prime position to exploit these customers. And a great stat to back this up: line rental charges have increased around 47% in the last few years, whereas the costs have fallen 27%. So they're really increasing their profit margins. And then towards the end, it looking for measures to help people shop around for better deals with more confidence. Of course, that's a great link to things like price comparison sites, things like Go Compare. So first things first, what is inertia classed as? What do we learn it in the spec as? It is irrational behaviour, and it's irrational behaviour by consumers. Okay, and the example of inertia here I'm going to give is from the extract where it mentions, I believe it mentions 1/3 of BT's customers haven't yet. So one quarter of BT's landline customers have never switched. That is a great example for inertia. So what I'm going to say is that we assume in economics that consumers are rational. They make decisions to maximize their utility, and one thing that would maximize their utility in this scenario is lowering their costs. However, as we know, consumers, due to certain things, are irrational, and we can see that with, again, in the extract it mentions how the price of these lines, these landlines, have increased from around 23 to 47%, but individuals are still not switching. And why is that? Of course, that could be because they find it difficult to switch. They have brand loyalty. They just genuinely can't be bothered to switch. Therefore, it means despite BT increasing the price, the quantity demanded is not falling significantly. If you saw that on the diagram, of course, it would look something like this, which of course, what does that represent? Inelastic demand. So that's how I would write that paragraph. Let's now move on to the evaluation stage of the paragraph. So essentially, we're saying that they have inelastic demand as they continue paying higher prices, despite, even though they pretty much shouldn't be. But again, I'm going to evaluate this with a bit of application, which is right at the start of the extract, where essentially it says that Ofcom or the CMA is going to step in and is going to force the BT to drop its prices from £18.99 to £11.99. Thus, it basically means that consumers will not be being exploited and there's less inertia. As if now consumers are getting a good deal, there's no reason to switch, so they can comfortably stay with BT. So however, in evaluation, this depends on the degree of regulation by either Ofcom or CMA. So that's how I'd word that evaluation point there. Of course, you can go into a bit more depth with it, but now let's get started with our second paragraph. So the second paragraph, of course, is going to be on like the elderly side of things. So it's going to be on information gaps. You can go into specifics of which information gap you want to mention. You could mention like things like asymmetric information, incomplete information. But yeah. So my application here, I believe it says that either 1/3 or 1/4 of BT customers were, 2/3 of the landline customers were over 65, which of course is a great bit of application to use. So the next chain is going to be essentially just talk about how they struggle to access things like comparison sites like Go Compare due to a lack of digital literacy, and then of course why that leads to them sticking to the same deal. So I've just written that out just to help explain it. So due to information gaps, A.G 2/3 of BT landline customers are over 65. Therefore, they struggle to access things like comparison sites. Comparison sites is a really good thing to always mention. It links to a really good part of the spec of technological change. Of course, comparison sites are allowed for things like this, but of course they help solve that gap of information. But due to limited digital skills, it means they have incomplete information with regards to alternative providers and prices. This imperfect information, which is just another word for incomplete information, leads to a misallocation of resources, as these consumers are not aware of the lower cost decisions. Therefore, they allocate their resources incorrectly, as essentially, if they had complete information, if they knew all the prices in the market, it is likely that they would spend their money somewhere else. They'd spend it at a cheaper alternative, but as they have incomplete information, they have a lack of information. They will allocate their resources here, whereas in reality, therefore that meaning is a misallocation of resources. But yeah, that's a really good point. Now let's move on to evaluation. Now, I think a really good evaluation point here is kind of undermining BT to a massive extent, where I think in the previous paragraph we talked about one quarter of BT customers have never switched. But I think you could really evaluate that by saying, however, in evaluation, this depends on whether there is a lack of information, whether the only reason consumers are not switching is due to the information gap, as consumers may actually just prefer BT, they may prefer the reliability, and they may just have a preference where they want to stick to BT. So we're just saying that 1/4 of consumers have never switched because of inertia, whereas that might not be true, or due to information gaps, where that might not be true, as they might just stick to BT as they have a good reputation. They like BT, for example, it's good customer service. So you could argue that it's actually to BT's credit rather than to consumers' downfall. And then a really good second evaluation point you can mention is on the time frame, where you could talk about digital literacy essentially, where we say that these consumers, the elderly, they're not switching due to they don't have the digital literacy. But you could talk about in the long run, as like for example me, as we get older, we will have much better and digital literacy with things like courses, things like campaigns is improving. Then we could talk about in the long run, digital literacy will improve, therefore information gaps will not be a reason why consumers do not switch. So in the short run, yes, this may be a problem, but in the long run, with digital literacy improving, it will therefore no longer be a problem. So have an evaluation, this depends on the time frame. Moving on to this 12-mark question. Discuss one likely reason for the rise in BT's profits. Using figure 2, extract B and C, and this is a good question, use a cost revenue diagram to support your answer. So if you've watched the question structure video, you know for 12-mark questions, this is an absolute gem. If it ever tells you to use a cost/revenue diagram, that means at least 8 of your marks are just analysis marks, just you talking about the diagram, you basically using the diagram dynamically, shifting the diagram, whatever it needs to be in this question. And it means it's a lot easier and simpler to pick up these 12 marks. So let's get right on with it. So let's break this down really simply. What is the formula for profits? Profits is of course revenue minus costs. So what can we do to boost profits? What are the 2 scenarios where profits will be boosted? Of course, we can either have increased revenue or we can have decreased costs. These are the 2 scenarios where we will see an increase in profits. Now let's have a read of these 2 extracts, B and C, to try and find where examples of where it's shown increases in revenue or decreases in costs. So that would be here, and let's have a look through this. So first line, BT Group reported a rise in profits as revenue increased. So that gives me my first indicator of what I am going to show, what I'm going to shift on this diagram. Since if revenue is increasing, of course, on our cost/revenue diagrams, we have a curve called D equals AR. So demand equals average revenue, which of course is therefore, if revenue is increasing, that means this is going to shift outwards. But now, if our D equals AR is shifting outwards, what curve does this also relate to? There's of course a direct relationship between D equals AR and then your MR curve. Since remember, the relationship is that MR is always twice as steep as your AR curve. That means now we can now conclude that both our D equals AR and our MR curve are both shifting out. And the big thing you need to make sure to remember with these cost revenue diagram questions, you have to make your diagram dynamic. Essentially what that means is shift a curve, shift 2 curves, shift as many curves as possible, as you will be limited to the lower levels. If you just show a monopoly diagram, just a D equals AR, just a normal monopoly diagram, you will be limited to the lowest level of KA. Why? Since these 12-mark questions, when they say use a cost revenue diagram, you need to be dynamic. But back to the extract, why are they experiencing this rise in revenue? Of course, it's due to the integration, the merger between BT and EE was finalised, meaning that they're controlling more of the market share. If they're controlling more of the market, of course, they are therefore receiving increased demand, and increased demand therefore will cause increased revenue. Or a more step-by-step way you could put it, increased demand means more sales, you times the sales by the price, this will therefore give you increased revenue. And of course, we have had a look through this extract C in previous questions. Essentially what it's talking about is how BT were exploiting consumers with higher landline prices, but the question does also say have a look at figure 2. So let's see what figure 2 is showing us. So the monthly rental cost of telephone landline, and we have a key here. We have a little wholesale line rental. Wholesale line rental is the rental price BT Openreach charges telephone service providers. So what is this exactly showing? So if you have a look at the important things, BT Retail, the price they are charging consumers has been steadily increasing every single year. But now the prices that they can provide these services at, the prices they charge telephone service providers, has been decreasing. Essentially, what does that show? What does that mean for BT's costs? If they can provide it for lower costs and they're consistently charging consumers higher prices, of course, this means firstly their costs are reducing. And how does that relate to, and of course, in the end, these higher profit margins. But the main thing is, which is this bit, which are the costs are reducing. How does that relate to our diagram? Of course, you can therefore say our cost curves, which are AC and MC, would be decreasing. And if you wanted to be more specific, you could of course therefore say this is as variable costs are decreasing, and of course if variable costs are decreasing, both MC and AC will shift downward. Let's get started with the cost revenue diagram. To pick up the marks for the diagram, of course you need to draw a cost revenue diagram, then you need to shift. You need to show some shifts to pick up the maximum marks of the diagram. But in this scenario, we do not need to show both the increase in revenue and increase and decrease in costs. So I'm just going to pick one. I am going to pick the increase in revenue, as I think it's a bit easier. If you have enough time, if you can be bothered, you can show them both, but you do not need to, and you can get 12 out of 12 marks here by just shifting your just basically showing an increase in revenue, which would be your demand equals AR curve and your MR curve shifting out. So let's get on with drawing this. So let's draw our original curve. So D equals AR. Just of course, this is a simple monopoly diagram, nothing different, no added details. So AC, then we have our MC curve, and let's finish this off with the profit maximization point. Of course, where MC equals MR, then we go down from there to find our Q max, the quantity at where we are profit maximizing. We would go up from there to find what this would now, we go up until we hit our D equals AR curve, then we go left, which will tell us the P max price. Then how do we find our profits? That's super profit. We go from Q max, we keep going, go up until we hit our AC curve, and this will now tell us our box of super normal profit. And now let's finish this off by showing how we would show an increase in revenue. Because of course, like I said, if there's what is the reason for a rise in BT's profit? They have merged, so therefore there's an increase in the firm's sales. They have more market share, therefore sales times price equals revenue, so therefore an increase in revenue. And like I said, whenever D equals AR shifts out, it will always cause MR to shift out also. So now let's shift out our D equals AR to now D equals AR1, and now MR. Just finishing off with our costs, of course. So how do you find your costs? You go from Q max 1, keep going up until you hit your AC curve, which will be just about there, and then we go left from there, which will give us now our costs, which are pretty similar to the last ones. But now this would therefore mean this is our new improved or bigger box of supernormal profit, which you would expect from increased revenue. So now I'm going to be very simple, state my point, of course include application. I'm probably going to go down the route of monopoly power, since of course I think the extract mentions have 35% market share. So let's get on with that. So one likely reason for the rise in BT's profits is integration with EE, therefore meaning larger market share. So just for the application marks, I did a reference to the profits rose to 566 million, I think it's in the second quarter of 2017. But the way I'm going to continue on this chain of analysis, I'm going to quote the extract again. I think it mentioned that the market share has now risen with the integration with EE, has now risen to around 35%. If the market share is now 35%, what does that mean? It means they qualify as a legal monopoly. Thus, of course, if they qualify as a legal monopoly, it will therefore mean they have a degree of monopoly power. And of course, if you have 35% market share, it really does show in the market there may be a lack of substitutes. Therefore, it gives them a degree of inelastic demand. And of course, what is that going to lead to? It's going to lead to an increase in revenues for the firms. Why they have that monopoly power, they can increase their prices, and for consumers are almost forced to still buy from them since they have that degree of inelastic demand. Meaning that I'm going to quote how, meaning that demand equals AR shifts out to D equals AR1, and this will therefore lead to an increased box of supernormal profit. And of course, you could mention that that is one reason why BT's profits have now increased due to an increase in revenues. Just to put that in writing, 35% market share, thus, like I said, qualifies them as a legal monopoly. They therefore have that monopoly power, which gives them a degree of inelastic demand. So therefore, they can increase prices, as you can see on a diagram of P max to P max 1, and it leads to an increased revenue from D equals AR, which is here, to D equals AR1. And that, of course, if you have an increase in revenue, of course, it means that you will have a larger box of supernormal profit, thus meaning that relating it back to the question, one likely reason for the rise in BT's profits is due to larger revenues. And now let's move on to the evaluation stage of this paragraph. Now, with regards to evaluation, the main point, of course, I'm going to mention is the blaring red flag, which is extract C, where essentially it's talking about how Ofcom had to step in and cause BT to reduce its prices, and of course with basically it's, the way it worked, the evaluation point. However, in evaluation, this depends on the degree of regulation. As Ofcom have stepped in, they've decreased BT's prices. Thus, is going to really reduce the degree to which BT can therefore make supernormal profit, and could lead to actually a reduction in BT's profits instead of an increase in BT's profits. And of course, you can talk about other evaluation points, like something like time frame, as of course there's a massive bit of BT's revenue was older individuals, but now as the younger generation is getting older, they are more electronically literate, so they're better with technology, they're more technologically literate. Therefore, with the younger generation getting older now, they will not have the same degree of information gaps as the older generation, thus meaning that they will not be able to exploit the older generation as much, meaning that their profits could also reduce. But yeah, that's all you need for evaluation with this question. Like I said, with these cost revenue diagrams, if it explicitly mentions it, a lot of the marks in your question will be dedicated specifically to that diagram. So make sure you address it well. You, of course, don't make any mistakes with your diagram, and then make sure you include the diagram in your chains of analysis. Short chain of analysis needed, a few valuation points, and that should be a concise and you could actually surplus this question where you could save a few minutes on this 12-mark question and then use that towards your 15-mark question. But yeah, let's now move on to that 15-mark question. Moving on to this 15-mark question. So, discuss methods of government intervention to protect consumers within utilities markets such as energy and telecommunications. So the two examples that are given us in the extract. Now, so what are some examples of government intervention, or as some of you may know it a bit better, what are some examples of regulation where the government or like the CMA can involve themselves in the market to regulate to protect consumers? And a few should pop into your mind. This is, of course, part of the spec. It should be content knowledge you have revised. If you have not revised it, of course, flashcards are available and revision notes on the udoecon.com website. But the main things that come to my mind are things like profit regulation, where a regulatory firm, where a regulator steps in and regulates a firm's profits, isn't used as much anymore since, of course, due to the entire concept of the profit incentive. If you reduce a firm's profit incentive, it makes them quite inefficient usually. But then other things like price regulation, of course, the classic, where the CMA regulates the price, as you can see in this extract here, where the price has been regulated, where it's falling from £19 to £12 now. Then other things such as how we can encourage small firms, things like reducing competition, deregulation. Why? Since there's a whole chain of analysis you can develop on that, where if we reduce the barriers to entry in markets such as energy and telecommunications, means new firms will enter the market. That increases the contestability in the market, thus increasing the levels of competition in the market, which leads to several benefits. And things like merger policy, or just providing like startups with the loans, things like that. So there's many different ones you can talk about here, but which are the ones I would pick here with regards to government intervention to protect consumers? Now, when protecting consumers, what is the main way consumers are being exploited in most of these markets? What is the main theme being of this extract? Of course, it's been with prices. So we want to stop consumers being exploited via prices. So how can we stop consumers being exploited via prices? Of course, the CMA can regulate them. And how can they regulate them specifically on price? What can we include there? We can include something like a maximum price, where with a maximum price, of course, it sets an upper limit to how much firms can charge consumers, thus meaning that they are no longer being exploited. So that's a good one paragraph you can speak about, where the CMA can, and then of course you'd add a lot of the chain of analysis, a lot of the detail of monopolies, where you can talk about these firms have this degree of monopoly power, they're able to exploit consumers, thus the CMA have to step in to protect consumers. They regulate the prices by setting a maximum price, thus meaning that consumers, of course, are no longer being exploited. There's many other points you can speak about here, things like stopping anti-competitive practices. So the CMA sometimes intervenes in markets to stop firms limit pricing, predatory pricing. Why? Of course, as the name suggests, these are anti-competitive practices. They stop new firms entering the market. So the CMA comes in and regulates them to stop incumbent large monopolies doing this. And other things like demerger policy, or stopping the merger occurring. Things like providing new startups with loans could also be used. But what would I pick for my paragraph points? Of course, the main paragraph point I am going to talk about is just CMA regulating. And if you think about the theme of the question talks about how we're going to protect consumers. What is the main way consumers are being exploited here? What has been the main theme of our extracts? Since if you look back to the question before, we're thinking about profits. So the main way consumers have been exploited in this extract is, of course, prices. That prices have risen too high, and why is that? Of course, since, and the way I'd link this to is these type of energy telecommunication firms have monopoly power, and they use that monopoly power to exploit consumers. Thus the CMA has to regulate, they have to do some sort of price regulation. And the price regulation that I would talk about, an appropriate policy we could use, is of course maximum prices. So we can set a maximum price, of course, sets an upper limit to how much firms can charge consumers. Thus, if we set that maximum price below the equilibrium price, it means that consumers, you could say, are now no longer being exploited. This is a really good point to mention for your first paragraph. But another thing, like we mentioned earlier, another policy the CMA or the government could intervene and use is something like increasing the levels of competition in the market, and you may call this deregulation. So deregulation will mean firms can enter the market more easily. Why? Since there are less barriers to entry. Things like legal barriers, patents, copyrights, trademarks. If you get rid of things like this, especially in a market such as the energy market, if you get rid of things like the legal barriers, it can really help new starting firms to enter the market. And you can see how this chain of analysis will develop as it leads to better prices for consumers, maybe better quality for consumers. But now let's go into depth with these paragraphs and let's see how I would write these out. Let's get started on this first paragraph, and like I said, we're going to do it on maximum prices. And what else can we call a maximum price in terms of like energy markets? We could also call it a price cap. And for some of you that do know, RPI plus K, RPI minus X, that sometimes just pop up in extracts here or there. So that's a good thing to know, but it's not required knowledge. But with maximum prices, how we're going to show this on a diagram, I am actually going to draw two diagrams here. I'm going to draw one cost revenue diagram and one maximum price diagram, since I'm just going to add a bit more detail into why the CMA is regulated. So talk about how these firms in energy, in telecommunication markets usually have this monopoly power. They can exploit consumers. Thus it's necessary for the CMA to intervene in the market, the government intervention, to then stop this degree of monopoly power, stop these firms exploiting consumers. But anyway, let's get started with this maximum price or price cap diagram. So of course it's just simple supply and demand diagram. Then where would we set a maximum price? And this is all to do with the equilibriums. So equilibrium currently is at PE and QE, but now we will actually not label QE for now. But why are we setting a maximum price? We are setting a maximum price since the price at equilibrium, the current price in the market is too high. Therefore, we want to set the new maximum price. The maximum price needs to be lower than the equilibrium price to have any effect. Since if we set the maximum price here, this will therefore mean what? It will mean that prices will still go back to equilibrium, meaning that it has no effect on the market. So we always set maximum prices below the equilibrium price level at P max, and let's see what this causes in the market itself. So we label this QS and then we'll label this QD, and of course since prices are lower than equilibrium, you could also comment on maybe an evaluation this leads to excess demand. But that is the first diagram, and the second diagram of course is going to be simple cost revenue diagram. So back on with the paragraph. One method that the government can intervene to protect consumers is by setting maximum prices or a price cap. And the bit of application I'm going to include is way back to Extract A, where we do talk about a price cap. Now the government claimed that this price cap could save households up to £100 a year, and that is a bit of application I am going to use. So my chain of analysis now is going to go pretty much, I'm going to focus this paragraph on the energy market. So I'm going to talk about the big six, of course, in energy, things like firms like British Gas. British Gas has a market share of around 25%, which again would classify it as a legal monopoly. I'm just going to start off with mentioning how the British Gas has this monopoly power, therefore it can profit maximize where MC equals MR. Thus, what is the big thing about monopolies? They're price makers. That is what monopoly power is. They're price makers, thus can set their own price, and they use that price making power, that monopoly power, to therefore charge price PMAX, which is to consumers being exploited. As we know, if you want to show this on a diagram in monopolies also, this triangle here represents, what does it represent? It represents welfare loss due to monopolies profit maximizing. So you could also reference that in your extract. So I've given a bit of context on why the government need to intervene. Now I'm going to talk about how they intervene. So therefore the CMA or government would intervene in this market by setting a maximum price, and then I'm going to reference this diagram a bit more. So then exactly how I walked you through it, I would go about it in that step-by-step manner. So the market originally is at equilibrium where PE meets QE. So at this point here, this is at the point where consumers are being exploited. Thus, so when the government intervened in the market, they would set the maximum price. They would make these firms charge a price lower than the equilibrium price, thus meaning that, of course, what effects would that mean? If now consumers are being charged lower prices, it means things like consumer surplus, consumer welfare would increase and improve. And thus, as a conclusion, basically, consumers are being exploited to a lesser degree. Why? Since prices are now lower. And one of the main things I've not mentioned yet is, of course, all this links into protecting consumers. It all links into allocative efficiency. And of course, with consumers being exploited, it is a massive degree of allocative inefficiency. But for those top level students, what you can actually do, you can show this price cap on the cost revenue diagram itself. So the way you do that is essentially what you do, the point at where we are allocatively efficient, which is of course where MC equals AR. At that point, all you do is draw a horizontal line that pretty much goes through that point and label it price. You can literally label it P cap, and that would be the point, and that would be our price cap. Why? Since of course that would solve the allocative inefficiency, since now firms are charging the allocatively efficient price, and it is a lower price, thus meaning consumers are no longer being exploited. So it's a really good thing to mention in these paragraphs, and a really bit of a good added detail you could mention here. And this also means this green triangle we've drawn of deadweight loss will also disappear, where we'd gain a bit of consumer surplus back, and then the deadweight loss would itself disappear. So it's a really good thing to mention, and a really substantiated, great argument here. Okay, so I've written most of that up, but now moving on to the evaluation stage of this paragraph, I am going to mention, of course, we're talking about price caps. And with price caps, a great one to always mention is regulatory capture. So like I said before, you can talk about RPI plus K, RPI minus X. There's some popular price caps. It's good information to know. But essentially, what does regulatory capture mean? It means that the regulator becomes fond of the firm they're regulating, and maybe they don't set the K too high or they set the X too low. So essentially, the price cap is not where it should be. So maybe this P cap here is not at the allocatively efficient price, as the regulator has fallen fond, therefore somewhere around here, thus of course limiting the positive effects to consumers, limiting the degree of allocative efficiency we gain, the consumer surplus, the consumer welfare that benefits. So the word however in evaluation, this depends on the degree of regulatory capture, and then I will talk about how regulators, if they fall fond of the firms they are regulating, they may set K too high or X too low. And if you have no idea about what I mean by them, it's good to research these. So RPI plus K and RPI minus X. There's some good price caps just for a bit of added knowledge to research. And of course, another great evaluation point you could mention is what we're assuming here. And remember, always think about the assumptions we're making. The big one is that British Gas will be profit maximizing. You could say, however, in evaluation, this depends on a business objectives. As a business, they could be profit satisfying, for example, thus reducing the degree to which they are actually exploiting consumers. Since if they're profit satisfying, they could actually be charging closer to that allocatively efficient price, thus meaning the degree to which consumers are exploited or the degree to which a maximum price will improve consumer welfare is limited. And I don't want to overload here too much with the valuation, since of course you will not need 3 evaluation points per paragraph, but the reason for a lot of these videos is just revision. So of course, for different questions, not all of these evaluation points will be relevant, but maybe 1 or 2 of them will be. Therefore, you can apply these evaluation points you've learned, you've revised to different questions. So another evaluation point for this, of course, is we're talking about government regulation, and whenever the government intervene in the market, there will also always be a degree of government failure. It's a great one to mention. You can talk about how the government could have, the opportunity cost of the government introducing a maximum price here. Of course, there's lots of admin costs associated with the government setting this maximum price. Have they actually improved the conditions in the market? Are we now at the socially optimum point? And is there better policies we could have used instead of setting a maximum price here? So it depends on the degree of government failure. So the word is however in evaluation, this depends on the degree of government failure, as the government would have dedicated significant admin costs, significant time to implementing this maximum price, and it may not be at the socially optimum point, it may not be at the best point for society, thus meaning that the government have intervened trying to improve the allocation of resources, but it's actually overall led to a misallocation of resources. But yeah, that's how I'd evaluate this paragraph, and now let's move on to the second paragraph. Moving on to the second paragraph, and this paragraph is all going to be about how the government can intervene to protect consumers via, and this one way the CMA / the UK government does it, they increase competition within the market. And how can we increase competition within a market? We can do that by a concept called deregulation. How does deregulation increase competition within the market? As deregulation, for example, if we're reducing regulation, this links entirely to barriers to entry. It means the barriers to entry within the market are lower, and if the barriers to entry within the market are lower, this means there's increased contestability, and if there's increased contestability, what does that mean? It means it's easier for firms to enter the market, thus this should and this will lead to an increased level of competition, as it's easier for firms to now enter the market. A specific example you can give with regards to the telecommunication industry is radio licenses. So they're called radio spectrum licenses, and essentially all the big firms buy them, and this is how essentially the mobile networks work within the UK. But one way the government can help new entrants enter the market, make it easier for new firms to enter the market, which of course we'll explain later on why it helps, why it protects consumers. But one way the government can intervene to help this out is they can allocate some radio spectrum licenses specifically for new entrants. As usually what happens is that the big incumbent firms like Vodafone, EE, they essentially end up buying up all these radio spectrum licenses, and new firms don't even get a chance. So the one way the government can intervene in the market is allocating some just to new entrants, which would of course lower barriers to entry, thus increase the levels of competition within the market. So we've ended that chain of analysis saying more competition. But what does more competition actually mean? And let's try to be as step by step as possible, squeeze as many marks, as much information from this chain of analysis as possible. So more competition will mean there's more firms competing in the market. And what does that mean? It means there's more firms competing for customers. And if there's more firms competing for customers, let's think about the new entrants versus the existing firms, so the incumbent firms. This means the new firms will be essentially stealing demand away from the incumbent firms, since these new entrants will enter the market, maybe set a lower price and steal customers away from these incumbent firms such as Vodafone, such as O2, such as EE. So let's try and look at the cost revenue diagram now of an incumbent firm when the government deregulates the industry and it means that more firms enter the market. So of course we have a normal just monopoly diagram, D equals AR, so let's just quickly label this up, D equals AR, MR, MC. We have this box of super profit, of course, Qmax and Pmax. But now, what do we say? So that new firms will enter the market and steal these incumbent firms' demand away. So they're stealing customers. So how can we represent that on the diagram? Of course, that is going to be shown by your demand curve shifting inwards. Since why? If other firms are stealing your demand, this means demand will, of course, decrease. And same thing with MR. So now, let's see the effect on price this has. So let's see the effect this has on price. So price will now go from Pmax to Pmax1, and of course a lower quantity as well. So why do you think this is? This is because new entrants are entering the market, they're stealing demand away from the incumbent firms, therefore these incumbent existing firms now are forced to lower prices to remain competitive within the market. Now, what is the aim of this question? What we're trying to actually answer in this question, we're trying to answer whether government intervention can protect consumers, and of course by firms now being forced, these existing incumbent firms, these oligopolistic firms being forced to lower their prices, this would therefore, we would say this is protecting consumers. Why? Since if you think about concepts like consumer surplus, allocative efficiency, with lower prices, we are definitely improving the consumer surplus in this market. So yes, you could conclude this paragraph by saying, yes, by government intervening, by them deregulating, new firms will enter the market, steal existing firms' demand away, thus causing these existing firms to be forced to lower their prices to remain competitive, thus meaning overall the outcomes for consumers would be better. Why? Since prices are lower, thus an increase in consumer surplus. Another massive thing you could comment on, of course, you can comment on productive efficiency, but also these large incumbent firms have these boxes of supernova profit. What you could also mention is that these new firms entering the market, this new competition, this new competitive drive forces these incumbent firms to reinvest more of their supernova profit into research and development, thus increasing the degree to which these incumbent firms are now dynamically efficient. As they're almost being forced to innovate to maintain their competitive edge, to maintain their market position, to maintain their market power, they have to spend more, they have to allocate more of their supernova profit into research and development to, like we said, to maintain that market share they have, to maintain that market power. And why is this level of competition positive for consumers? As when these incumbent firms will be investing into research and development, it will lead to better quality, of course, for consumers. So things like maybe network in rural areas, it will improve this. Overall, consumers will receive better quality products, but then also with better quality products, it may lead to new production methods which are cheaper, which are more efficient. Therefore, we could see a combination of better quality products at lower prices, which both, of course, would improve consumer welfare, improve consumer surplus. This is why I emphasize past paper practice. Absolutely perfect, a really good chain of analysis to practice, and one that is really likely to come up in some perspective in your exam. But now let's move on to the evaluation stage of this paragraph. And of course, just before we move on, of course, I've just been focusing more on the chain of analysis here. Make sure to use the extracts, include as much real world application as possible. Of course, when I was speaking, I was giving a bit more like include the examples of the real firms, include a few stats and figures, use the extracts. Of course, it's 50-mark question. You have the benefit of the extracts to use it to boost that application mark, to make sure you're hitting the highest levels for those application marks. Okay, so first things first, we ended the chain of analysis by talking about how these firms can, even though they're losing demand, they can still invest, the incumbent firms, they can still invest the remaining supernova profit into research and development. But then you can argue, a really good evaluation point to argue, however, in evaluation, this depends on the degree to which these firms can be dynamically efficient. As, for example, if these new firms, this new competition steals away most of these firms' demand, thus their profits are really low, it will therefore mean they don't have much money to allocate to research and development, thus meaning that they won't be able to be very dynamically efficient, thus meaning, of course, it will reduce the long-run benefits for consumers, such as better quality and lower prices. You could really argue, however, in evaluation, you could even say this depends on the degree of competition, or you could say this depends on the degree of dynamic efficiency by incumbent firms. With regards to our second evaluation point, it's very much to do with the question, and what is the main aim, what is the main thing we're addressing in the question, which of course would be protecting consumers. The policy we've suggested to help protect consumers would be deregulation. But now let's think back to why this regulation was in place originally. Of course, the reason why this regulation was instated originally by the government would be something along the lines of trying to protect firms and trying to protect consumers. So by us removing the regulation, the way you can evaluate this by saying, however, in evaluation, this depends on whether deregulation may actually harm consumers. As for example, it could lead to lower quality for consumers, and it could lead to like things like unsafe practices. For example, firms might start cutting corners. It may lead to firms that shouldn't really be in the market, who maybe don't have the capital, who don't maybe produce the quality that was usually required by regulation to produce. They could now enter the market, and in the end, who does it affect? In the end, it's going to affect consumers. Maybe in this scenario, it's going to lead to unreliable networks, maybe instability, where since there's not much regulation in the market, new firms enter the market, they become established, and they're not run well, and they leave instantly, thus meaning that consumers have to constantly switch networks. And overall, these would of course lead to worsening consumer outcomes. So deregulation is always a bit of a tricky one whether to pursue or not, since of course there is a reason why this regulation was originally instated, and it was originally instated for the reasons to protect consumers. So by removing it, a massive consequence could actually be at least a harm for consumers rather than benefit, like we suggested in the paragraph. And of course, you can mention how other policies could be more effective. Things like stopping anti-competitive practices, demerger policy could work better than something like deregulation. But yeah, there's lots of different evaluation points here. Even things like we mentioned in the last paragraph, government failure, the degree of government failure, short run versus long run, think about the time frame. Lots of different evaluation points here that you can focus on into. But that is where I'm going to wrap it up for this 15-mark question. That is section B for this 2019 paper 1 done. And let's now move on to the section C, the 25-mark question.